Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today, we are at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I have the chance to sit down with Mike Lukens. Mike is the Wilderness and Climbing Program Supervisor here at this iconic national park. And in this episode, we cover a whole lot, from rock climbing to wilderness and backcountry experiences, search and rescue missions, and a whole lot more. Mike, we are at beautiful Rocky Mountain National Park. We have Longs Peak right behind us, and we're getting some rain right now.
Yeah.
Hopefully just a slight drizzle, but you are the Wilderness and Climbing Supervisor here at Rocky Mountain National Park. Yeah. You've been here for 15 years. What's it like to work in such a special place?
You know, I moved here years ago for work, and I haven't left for a reason, of course. It's amazing in the fact that we have such diverse ecosystems in the park. We have mountains, obviously, and so many different activities in different places to explore. So it's been, you know, I've worked for the Park Service for a while. I've been in different locations, but obviously I've stayed for a reason.
I was telling you before we sat down to do this podcast, I was doing some research on your specific role as a park ranger. And on the National Park Service website, it lists off jobs, and it says that a climbing supervisor is among some of the most skill-wise elite rangers in the Park Service. How does that make you feel?
I mean, it's, you know, climbing rangers in general. So I supervise climbing rangers. I've been a long-term climbing ranger prior to being a supervisor of that work group. You know, it's just a very specific skill set that's necessary to be successful in the job. So if that makes us a lead or not, I don't know. Yeah.
We're going to talk all about climbing in this episode, but we're also going to talk about SAR and PSAR for folks who are unfamiliar with that, preventative search and rescue steps that we can take before we head out to the park to stay safe. But I do want to dive into your journey a little bit more. I believe you grew up in Washington State.
I did. Yeah, I grew up in Port Angeles on the Olympic Peninsula. Literally, Olympic National Park was my backyard. And I grew up with one of the long-term rangers from Olympic, kind of infamous guy, Jack Hughes, as my neighbor. So that was a unique, you know, childhood for me. I was able to spend a lot of time in the woods and in a national park and explore. I had park rangers come to my class. And that's really how I got my exposure to the Park Service, and they're saying there was even a career in this type of work.
When you saw rangers come to your class, did it inspire you to want to wear the gray and green one day?
Yeah, I would say at the end of the day, the fact that park rangers came into my class, took us into the park on field trips, and, you know, being able to explore and go on camping trips and climbing trips in the Olympics really influenced my decision to work for the Park Service.
What got you interested specifically in climbing? Is climbing big in Olympic?
You know, mountaineering is pretty big. You know, it's Olympic mountains, but like technical rock climbing, ice climbing, things like that are not huge. You know, for whatever reason, since I was a kid reading books about, you know, folks climbing in the Himalayas and all over the world, always got me interested. And I didn't really start climbing until I was in Boy Scouts in middle school, doing mountaineering trips in the Olympics, and then later on in the Cascades, getting into more rock climbing and ice climbing and things like that. And I climbed Mount Rainier at like the age of 16 with a group of friends. But I spent a lot of time just exploring the Olympics and doing what we would consider general mountaineering.
I know this could be tough to choose, but is there a specific peak that you've reached that stands out to you that, you know, was a life goal of yours or was a special experience?
Anywhere in the world?
Yeah, anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, let's see. 2 winters ago, I climbed Serene in Patagonia. I'd been on like the tick list. I'd tried it prior and got shut down due to weather and conditions. I spent a fair amount of time in Patagonia over the years climbing. In the winter here, but in the summers there. And so that was one of my lifelong goals. And that's basically because of the technical difficulty of climbing that mountain. And then just like the odds are pretty low of actually being successful summiting.
How did that make you feel when you did summit?
I mean, it was, you know, one of those kind of crazy moments where like, I'm here, but the weather's changing and we got to get it out of here. So it was great. We celebrated at the top for all about 30 seconds to start descending, knowing that we had a long ways to go, you know, probably 30 hours of descending by the time it's said and done. And then going into knowing a storm was coming in while we were hopefully going to beat it, right? So we got out of the most like technical portions of the mountain and got down to what would be more safer terrain before really the big winds and rain and snow came in on us.
How about in the United States? Is Longs Peak at the top of your list, or is there other peaks?
I've certainly climbed Longs more than any other peak in the United States. Longs is definitely a very special mountain. The east face, which we can see, the Diamond of Longs, has some of the hardest technical rock climbing in the world. And so, yeah, it's probably some of the routes I've climbed on there are some of my greatest accomplishments also.
That's awesome. Is there any other areas in Colorado you like to recreate or climb? I know it's tough when things become a profession to want to continue climbing recreationally. But
the Black Canyon, Gunnelson's got some really amazing like multi-pitch climbing. I spent a lot of time kind of in the San Juans in the winter ice climbing and mixed climbing. And then we just recreate my family. So I have a 7-year-old and a wife. And we spend a lot of time just recreating in the winter, skiing. In the summer, we'll go rafting and boating and doing some climbing wherever it might be. So I spend a lot of time kind of in the Moab zone for climbing in kind of the fall and spring, and Indian Creek, which is part of Bears Ears. That's also like one of my favorite places to go. But that's more like single pitch, what's called trad climbing, where you're placing gear and climbing cracks.
I do want to dive into the various forms of climbing, which mentioned before that we wanted to dive into, but I mentioned your role earlier as wilderness and climbing supervisor. What all does that role specifically entail here at Rocky Mountain?
Sure. So I supervise both permanent and seasonal climbing rangers. I supervise our basically backcountry wilderness rangers, and then I oversee wilderness compliance for the park. So I'm the chair of the wilderness committee. The park was designated basically 95% wilderness under the Wilderness Act in 2009. And as part of that, there's some legal obligations that the park has to fulfill. So I oversee much of that also.
How has your role changed since that the wilderness designation of this park?
Yeah, I mean, the park as a whole, so functionally anything that's eligible or proposed wilderness, the Park Service by agency policy is supposed to treat as wilderness. And so historically, we've tried to treat the park even prior to that designation as wilderness in terms of agency actions and management plans and work within wilderness, if that makes sense. More so, my job has changed drastically as I become a supervisor rather than what was a work lead for the climbing program, a permanent ranger, where I spent more time in the field climbing and working with our seasonal staff. And, it was more of like a 80% field versus 20% office versus now I'm more like 50, 60% in the office doing things, budgetary stuff, managing personnel. Overseeing search and rescue operations is more of like an operational side or incident commander versus being like the point of the spear in the field. But I still get out and patrol also.
In your role, are you teaching people how to climb or recreate, or are you mostly doing the rescues and search and rescue like you had mentioned?
Yeah, so we do not like teach people or take people out as in like a guide fashion. There are, concessionaires in the park that work, mountain guides that take folks out to teach them to climb, get paid to take folks up Longs Peak, things like that. We are out patrolling for many reasons. One is to educate and talk to folks, check route conditions, both for educating the public about the conditions, and then also route familiarity for rescue purposes, and then cleaning up trash and things like that. Just general leave no trace ethics, and then there's the whole other side of the rescue world of someone has an accident in the mountains, and then we need to utilize those skill sets to go and extract this person.
You do a whole lot in this park.
Yeah, Rocky's been historically in the top 3, top 4 for rescue load in the National Park Service. You have the Grand Canyon and Yosemite, and we're generally in the top 3 or 4. Yeah.
You mentioned leave no trace. Rock climbing and different types of climbing, there's a lot of equipment that's used, not only that's installed by the Park Service, but also that, recreators bring up with them. What's the balance of the dual mandate of keeping the wilderness raw versus making it accessible for certain types of climbing?
Yeah, for sure. Right. So, the agency has its own policy. Park Service wide, there's, each park has some leeway in terms of their interpretation and how they manage climbing. Internal to Rocky, we have a wilderness management plan that was written in 2001 that has a climbing management section in it. In there, talks about fixed anchors and their appropriateness and all sorts of things. So in general, we discourage the placement of fixed anchors unless they're absolutely necessary, right? We're trying to leave the wilderness as unimpaired as possible for the enjoyment of future generations, but realize that sometimes fixed anchors are necessary for the safety of folks recreating in the wilderness. And so it's that balance, right? It's a struggle, but even within the Wilderness Act, there is recognition of what is called the public purpose of wilderness, right? It is the fact that we set these lands aside for folks to recreate and enjoy and really go out and have these experiences that can be transformative for them.
We mentioned Long's Peak, which is behind us.
Yep.
What other peaks or mountains are there in the park that folks typically like to recreate on or climb?
Yeah, so across the park, there's a number of alpine features specific to like technical rock climbing that are very popular. Hallett Peak is one of them. In the Bear Lake Zone, as you go up towards Emerald Lake, it has one of the 50 classic climbs in North America on that peak, so it sees a lot of attention. And there's various other routes on that formation that are popular, along with the Sky Pond Zone. There's the Cathedral Spires, one of those being the Petit Grappon, which again is also one of those 50 classic climbs, and that probably gets even more traffic than any other route in the park. And there's a whole list of other like features in the park up in Glacier Gorge that are very popular with alpine climbing. In terms of bouldering, which is a whole different style of climbing, like Chaos Canyon and all these other areas with big boulders and boulder fields in the Alpine have become very popular and actually world renowned. And so we have folks that are traveling from all over and within the state to recreate in these high Alpine environments.
Do you have a favorite area that you like to recreate or explore in?
Yeah, it depends on what I'm looking to do, right? In the winter, skiing may be a little bit different, but like Glacier Gorge and Upper Glacier Gorge, I think is one of the most beautiful places in the park in terms of alpine climbing and the setting. There's far-flung locations in the northern part of the park or down in Wild Basin that if you want to get away from the beaten path and have, I would say, more of kind of this primitive experience and opportunity for solitude, those are more of my favorite areas.
You mentioned high alpine climbing. What style and bouldering, what styles of climbing is there? What all does high alpine climbing entail?
Sure. So technically, it depends. There's a multitude of mediums to climb on, right? And there's a multitude of styles of climbing. So what we say is alpine climbing is basically climbing in the mountains, multi-pitch, long routes. Not a lot of resources available if you have an incident, and much more self-reliant. And generally takes a little bit more of a mastery of multiple skill sets. There's traditional climbing or trad climbing, which is using gear. Mostly these days it's removable, so cams and chalking devices or nuts, where you're placing gear in cracks, you're climbing those cracks or features on the wall, and you're removing that gear. And then there's sport climbing, which is, in general, fixed anchors, which are bolts and like basically a hardware anchor in the rock where you clip as your fall protection. We don't have a ton of sport climbing in the park. In fact, there's not really any that we classically say is sport climbing, but Boulder Canyon and some other areas in the zone are very popular with sport climbing. Generally, those are single pitch. So you climb, half a rope length or so, maybe 100, 150 feet, and you come back down to the ground, versus like multi-pitch climbing, which is you're climbing rope length after rope length after rope length till you're to the top of a feature. And then there's bouldering, which is some people refer to as pebble wrestling, but climbing, large boulders, and mostly, in areas with good landings or things like that, but not always. But generally, bouldering has some very hard sequential moves, right? So people are really honing in on kind of like this gymnastic style of climbing, very difficult, but for short periods of time or short lengths.
Some people call it pebble wrestling. You would never call it that, right?
No, by no means. I mean, honestly, there are some boulders in this park. I don't climb. It's called highball bouldering. They're 30 feet tall, right? If you were to fall off potentially without a good spotter and good crash pads, you could be seriously injured. Versus there's other boulders that are like 6 to 8 feet. Their consequences are pretty low if you come off.
How does climbing change in the park by season with weather?
Sure. We're on the shoulder season now, as you see, with the rain and probably snow up high. We're still kind of in this mix of spring, winter to summer. And so there's still alpine climbing up high that involves ice climbing. So on Mount Meeker right now, Dreamweaver is a very popular route for folks, and it's climbing snow and ice and rock. To, fast forward to July, August, it's mainly rock climbing up high.
And how does hiking, when you're up in those mountains, do you encourage folks that aren't necessarily climbing but want to get some views to wear crampons or bring equipment like that with them?
Yeah, especially Long's Peak, which is a bit of a magnet for folks because it is a 14er in Colorado. The conditions are rapidly changing, and they can still rapidly change day to day based on storm activity. This time of year, when the route we would say is much more in winter conditions, it's got steep 45-degree snow slopes on it. high consequence falls if you were to slip and fall. We do definitely recommend people are bringing crampons and ice axe. And not only that, but the experience and knowledge on how to use those pieces of equipment. Because just because you carry an ice axe or have crampons, if you don't know how to utilize them in an appropriate fashion, they aren't going to do you a lot of good.
How important is it for folks to be familiar with their gear, but also just climbing in general before coming to Rocky Mountain? Is Rocky Mountain a good place for beginners to start climbing, or would you recommend that they have experience before coming to this park?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? So if you're trying to get into alpine climbing or multi-pitch climbing, right, that's not really where most people start learning to climb, although it's happened. It's not, the best recommendation. It's like anything. You train for things and get better and you develop skill sets, and then you pursue harder objectives or maybe higher consequence or more committing objectives, if that makes sense. So we really suggest people, especially if you're getting into technical climbing and want to climb in the park, that they kind of develop a really robust base set, right? So they're out maybe single pitch, drag climbing, and they're progressing, and how hard difficulties or routes they can climb, and also their ability to move through terrain in a safe manner, placing good gear, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We mentioned weather. How about, you mentioned Longs Peak is a 14er. How does altitude sickness potentially affect people who are climbing up into high altitudes?
Sure. Yeah. We have altitude illness can strike anyone. It doesn't matter how fit you are. The biggest issues we see, or the biggest red flags, would be someone coming from low elevation to high elevation in a quick period of time. We have altitude illness issues with, technical climbers on lungs, but more so we see it on the folks trying to climb the keyhole route and some of the more, classic third, fourth class routes. And that's because folks have this on their agenda as something they want to do, which is great. But then they fly from Florida, and day 2, they're already climbing the mountain. And all of a sudden they start feeling those effects of altitude. Their body hasn't had time to develop the appropriate, changes in order for them to adapt to the altitude. And so it's a challenge, right? Like the biggest thing we advise folks is, one, that you spend time at altitude, lower elevations, to slowly acclimate. It takes about 2 weeks fully to for your body to adjust. And most folks don't have that, right? So if you can, spend at least a week at elevation, doing some other lower elevation hikes prior to attempting something at higher elevation.
You mentioned the keyhole route a couple of times.
Yeah.
What is that route? What does it entail? And what do you see up there?
The keyhole route is probably the most popular route currently to climb the mountain. In terms of difficulty, it's probably also the lowest. And once again, that difficulty changes based on conditions and time of year. So we'll say mid-July, early August, it's snow-free, generally ice-free. It's at probably the lowest challenge for most folks in terms of skill sets and other hazards you might face, if that makes sense. And so the keyhole route is third, fourth class. It basically starts in the boulder field, which we're looking at the base of the north face. And it goes to the right skyline to a feature called the keyhole and kind of slowly circumnavigates the mountain, corkscrews around until you hit the summit.
How are those summit views at the top?
It's pretty amazing. Ironically, Longs Peak on the summit is basically a very flat. It's a unique mountain in the fact it's got basically a football field on top of it. It's very flat. We've landed helicopters up there when needed, but it's a unique in that aspect. But you can see into Wyoming, you can see down into the Park Range, you can see into Summit County, out into the Front Range. It's pretty amazing.
That is amazing. You've been climbing for a long time. And how has technology changed climbing, for better or worse, from what you've seen out in the park?
Yeah, overall, from when I started climbing to what I'm currently using for climbing, gear has changed drastically in terms of the weight, right? And diameters of ropes and all these things, ice tools, ice screws. It actually makes, I think, the experience better. Makes maybe the weight, obviously, you're carrying a lot less than maybe some of the folks climbing in the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s, right? Which helps, right? We can attempt harder and more difficult routes because of that. You're carrying less weight, you're less fatigued. But then we have other rises in technology like cell phones and mapping software and Garmin InReach devices and a whole litany of things where I think people are less reliant on some of the traditional skills that came with experience, came with, knowing how to read maps, how to read terrain, how to just navigate from dead reckoning, to much more reliant on technology to aid in that. Just as we're driving now, I use Google Maps rather than actually have to get out paper maps to figure out where I'm driving. If it's a new address or a new city, I can rail on my phone. I can plug in that address. And just like Google Maps sometimes leads you astray while you're trying to drive to some location. It could definitely lead you astray in the mountains. And so, while most folks are relying on phones or mapping software or Gaia or whatever it might be, it definitely has its errors and downside.
Would you recommend that folks print off, a topography map or something that they can reference and bring with them in their pack?
I mean, ideally, yes. The biggest thing is, battery life, right? Something fails. Like, what is your backup, right? And generally, if it's, first I recommend, obviously, if you're using a phone, they have the ability to charge that phone again because it's going to draw the battery life down, right? Using your GPS and some of the other features on that phone decrease the battery life significantly. So you have a way of charging that device back up, pretty important, right? But then what happens if you drop and break that device, which happens all the time? What is your backup then? And really the only backup for that is some sort of analog paper version. So we all carry maps of the park still. I've been in the park and I know most of the park very well, right? So most of the time I'm just dead reckoning in terms of navigating, but there's still times I pull up the map. I have to triangulate coordinates. I have to figure out where I'm at and we got to call a helicopter or something and like that, right? So having that baseline skill set, I think, is very important still. Unfortunately, I think, 30 years ago, that was kind of common for folks recreating in the backcountry. It's become less of a common skill set that people carry.
I think that answer leads us really well into search and rescue and your team's role in that.
Sure.
What does the search and rescue operation look like at this park? And you'd mentioned you're typically in the top 3 and having to do rescue missions. How difficult is it in this type of terrain to get to people, especially if they're doing high alpine climbing?
Yeah, it depends on where the incidents occur. So if we have an accident on Long's Peak, we have an accident on Glacier Gorge or the Continental Divide, it's very challenging to get to folks in a timely manner, right? If someone has a stable injury where they can sit and wait, time is less important. But if someone has had some sort of significant fall or traumatic injury, like time is of the essence. You've heard of the golden hour, right? So hiking someone just from headquarters where they may be or some other location to some far-flung location in the park may take all day. All right. And so we really have to start utilizing other assets to try and get people there. We use the military for helicopters. We contract helicopters. We use the state we use Flight for Life, medevac. So generally aviation becomes one of the primary assets we'll use for some of these rescues as they're farther and farther away in more severe terrain. But then we also have to battle with the weather. And so like days like today, it's really hard to know if we'd even be able to fly. We may be still going in on foot.
Do you or have you rappelled in these types of rescue missions out of a helicopter?
No, generally not rappelling, right? We're going to what it would be the closest spot that we can land a helicopter safely and then walking from that location. We have a whole list of known spots that we can land within the park. And so we'll usually start working off that knowledge. There are rappel ships within fire, like Wildland Fire, but it hasn't generally become a thing within search and rescue. We could have folks inserted with a hoist, on an aircraft and down hoisted in. That's happened before.
I always admire, and I don't think talk about enough, how skilled these helicopter pilots are as well, navigating this type of landscape and getting the helicopter up and down. I'm sure you've seen in your day some incredible missions and some incredible pilots that have gotten you in some tough areas.
For sure. We've definitely had some very, stressful rescues where it's like timing is of the essence. We have a storm cell coming through, we have a critical patient, and it's all up to doing this in the appropriate time for safety margins. And we've had those instances where they're basically nail biters, right? Are we going to get this done? Are we going to do it in a safe manner? Are we going to get out of there prior to this massive storm coming in with high winds and hail and lightning? So, the pilots are amazing that we work with. The skill sets that they've developed over basically a career of flying has set them up for success in the mountains. We've had some pilots come in the park that are uncomfortable with it, which is great, and turn down missions. And that's what we would rather have than someone trying to push their comfortability limits and their skills.
As a supervisor, you not only are on these missions, but you're working with a team of people who unfortunately have to see some really hard and traumatic injuries and incidents.
Yeah.
What is that like emotionally to manage a team after seeing an incident like that? And you have a family how is it managing that balance?
Yeah, it's a weird balance for me because not only do I have the responsibility of trying to oversee this operation and hopefully save or rescue whoever it is that's hurt, but I also have that responsibility on my shoulders to ensure that the folks that work for me come home safe and sound. And that's both physically and mentally, right? And so the long-term exposure to some of these high-stress events and traumatic events, it can take a toll pretty heavily on folks. And the Park Service, I would say, as a whole, has done a much better job over the last 10 years of recognizing the impacts that emergency services and high-risk rescues and law enforcement contacts, whatever it might be, has on the workforce, and has taken more of a proactive approach towards resiliency, availability of counselors, and debriefing and going through a process to hopefully help provide the tools for folks to proactively deal with these types of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I definitely have had folks that have worked for me or worked with me that have been drastically impacted from these types of rescues, either fatalities, people dying, or, some very serious injuries of known or unknown people that have taken a toll on them personally. And so it's my goal at the end of the day, right, that I set people up for success, that I take care of these folks that work for me so that when they leave this job at the end of the season, or if they leave the Park Service as a whole, that we haven't done more harm to them, right? Hopefully they leave in a better place than when they even started the job.
And as somebody who's, supervising and leading, that mission with your staff, I hope that you're also able to get that same support and recover from those types of events.
Yeah, I have a cohort of folks that are in similar positions to myself across the Park Service, that we have a network, right, of communication, because it is kind of a lonely position to be like in that supervisory role, right? It's like there's a lot of things, a lot of stressors from above and below that people don't necessarily understand. But yeah, my biggest fear at the end of the night is that one of my employees is going to either hurt or not come home, right? And that's what keeps me up at night.
You mentioned enlisting the military in certain operations with aircraft. What other local agencies do you enlist to be able to support in these types of missions?
Yeah, so the park is situated in several counties. So we have Grand County, we have Larimer County, which we're currently sitting in, and then Boulder County, which is a little bit south of us. And so we work very closely with those counties and their volunteer rescue groups. And so Larimer County SAR, Rocky Mountain Rescue Group, Grand County SAR, to assist us. So if we need additional resources, we need additional support or technical expertise, we'll reach out to those folks. And then we also work with Colorado Search and Rescue, which is basically a state entity that helps to oversee and support search and rescue across the state. And they've been a huge asset to us, along with, like I said, the National Guard or military in Colorado. So the Colorado Army National Guard for aviation assets and other support that they can provide.
How important do you think it is for folks that are coming here who, are very confident in their abilities, regardless of whatever style they're climbing, to have a sort of reverence for the wilderness and for the outdoors and the power that the wilderness can provide against somebody?
For sure. There's no matter how technically proficient you are, there's always things that we cannot control, right? There's always the potential for something to go wrong. Which is part of the thrill, I think, and reason that people participate in these types of activities, right? It's a little bit of the unknown, right? Not everything is under our control. But the same token, I always ask, and I try to do it myself and my staff, especially at work, right? It's like, we want to be a bit more reserved in our decision-making than you think is necessary, right? It's like, be a little bit more cautious than you think. If you encounter a section of poor rock quality or things like that, right, on route, and it can't be bypassed in a safe manner, like there could be like severe consequences if you continue on. And so it's a hard one, right? It's like, I ask folks, like, obviously go out and recreate and experience the things you're here to experience, but the same token, just realize that there are things outside of our own control. And if we leave a little bit in the tank, I guess you could say, and dial it back just a little bit, it'll help, I think, long run with people's ability to continue on with these pursuits.
The missions that you have to go on to rescue people, are they humbling to you too, to see what nature can cause?
For sure.
And obviously the journey that you have to go on to get to somebody?
Yeah, we have a range of incidents. Some of it's just really bad luck. Some of it is, massive rockfall that no one could have predicted. And it's just like, it's amazing because it could have just been as easily as been myself or someone else in the situation. It was just bad luck, right? It's like half a mountain just fell off. It's like those things you can't predict. There's nothing that anyone could have done to change the outcome besides just not been there at that point in time. But there was no evidence or anything to suggest that they shouldn't be. And so that's very humbling, right? There's it's just as easily could be anyone for those types of incidents versus there's other incidents where it's very clear that there was a chain of poor decisions made and are avoidable.
How much have you learned in this role in your 15 years here at Rocky Mountain to get to the point where you are now, obviously being a supervisor and leading this group? We talked about technology, but as you probably know this park now like the back of your hand, have you figured out more proficient and efficient ways to get around the park? And I'm sure you have certain areas that there's going to be incidents in pretty regularly.
Yeah, I mean, we have kind of those high use areas, also high repeat areas for rescues for sure. Obviously that infinite knowledge, and luckily enough for me, the seasonal staff and permanent staff that I have working for me all are like very seasoned rangers. They've been here for many years. They all have like that intimate knowledge of the park and how to get places in a safe manner and how to effectively and efficiently get places. But it plays hugely in how we go about and do our job on a day-to-day basis, but then also when there's an incident, right? The intimate knowledge of some of this terrain comes down to like, there's anchors here, there's not. This rock quality in this section is going to be poor, so how do we get around that? We may need to use a drill, unfortunately, to place some hard anchors to make it safer for us. Like that type of knowledge is our safety net, if that makes sense. And so it's hugely important.
That's fascinating. So when you're out you mentioned earlier, some of the times you go out there is not necessarily on a search and rescue mission, but it's to understand different routes in the park, get familiar with the park. On those types of kind of route finding missions, is that when you're making those decisions to potentially drill?
For sure. We'll make those notes. It's like, hey, like there's poor anchor, poor rock quality, and we actually have patrol logs that when folks are coming back at the end of the day, they're filling out and we can pull that information from. We also debrief once a week about these types of things as a work group together where we're on. But it's that sharing of knowledge, right, over time. It's like, yeah, I can place pitons here, or, it's got good normal protection or removal cams, or we have to go down a different method, or this terrain makes the most sense for this type of rescue technique versus another. And then we also do basically pregame out certain rescues on high use features like the Petit Grappin, where we basically have a cheat sheet on how a rescue and what kind of gear needs to be pulled is going to be done. Does that make sense?
Oftentimes in these podcasts, we talk about how it's really hard to understand and process geologic time and how things are changing over thousands of years. But in your case, since you know this park so well and you're out doing these route missions, are there certain years where you go out and you notice more erosion in a specific area or different geologic processes that have taken place to make things more challenging to get to?
For sure. It's like, obviously on a geological time scale, it seems like landscape change is a long-scale, long-term process, but like we see huge change even in short periods of time. Very sudden, abrupt changes that occur that drastically change access to climbing routes or access to other portions of the park. Several years ago, we had a rather large mass wasting event or a landslide in Upper Chaos Canyon, which was pretty impressive, right? And it was a massive amount of debris that moved, and so that drastically changed how that environment currently looks today. And so, yes, the glacial valleys and all these other things that took thousands and thousands of years to form, we're still having change in a very abrupt time period also.
Taking a step away from maybe climbing or, high alpine adventures, what about just typical backcountry wilderness adventures? What are, important messages for folks to know before going out in the backcountry here, whether it's leave no trace or just safety?
For sure. I mean, there's a whole list of things. Luckily, we do have a wilderness office here. So if folks are doing overnight backcountry permits, they come and pick up their permit at their office. It's actually just down the hill from here. And there's a good opportunity for those folks working in that station to give some of that information, both safety related, resource protection related in terms of wildlife and how to recreate appropriately in wilderness. And then also just general stuff about bear canisters, tents, when wayfinding. And so hugely important, right? So we focus a lot on protection of park resources, right? We focus a lot on protection of the people, right? And we also focus a lot on protection of people from the park and part from the people. It's kind of an interesting concept. But so yeah, leave no trace is huge for us, right? Talking about how do you appropriately recreate within wilderness and ideally leaving the minimal trace possible, right? Part of that's food storage. Part of that is staying on trails where it's appropriate and knowing where cross-country travel is authorized and allowed. Part of that is understanding, how not to impact the resources. You shouldn't be cutting trees down, all that kind of stuff. And then the other end of it's, how to be safe, right? Have the 10 essentials, have a plan, understand where you're going, do some research prior. But then also, be willing to explore a little bit and have fun.
Do you have fun in the backcountry?
I try to, for sure. I mean, that is, our job can be very serious. I like to say is like some of the best days I've ever had at work have been here on the clock in the backcountry. And some of the worst days I've ever had at work, anywhere I've worked in my life, has been, here at work on the clock, doing a body recovery or something like that, right? And then having to deal with the family on scene. So it's a job that has like many highs and many lows.
You are a very calm person, and it seems like a lot of people in search and rescue have this like calm, welcoming demeanor and presence. Have you always been this way, or has search and rescue kind of forced you into developing this demeanor?
I think probably it's just, predisposed. It's just my personality. I think probably the folks that stay around in these types of positions long run can't be very high strung. It's a high burnout rate otherwise. Like anything, like being a firefighter, police officer, anything involved in emergency services, a nurse, paramedic, right? It's like the folks that are high strung get worked up. Like it's just a job that will burn you out very quickly.
I was about to ask that. Do you have any interactions with the wilderness firefighting team here? Or,
sure, yeah.
Whether it's work or just consultation with each other, because you both go through a lot.
Yeah, so so the park has a militia. They have a core, like we have an Alpine Hotshots, we have a module, and we have some other like core firefighter folks that is their job. And then we have a militia within the park, which is folks like myself or others that have like a collateral duty as also to help with wildland fire. And so I am also part of the park's fire militia, so I will go out and help, depending on if we're doing stuff in the park or if they get ordered outside of the park, we'll send people that are not primary firefighters. And so we have, a very close relationship, very similar kind of stressors in the job environment and similar, I'd say, things that plague people, if that makes sense. And so, I think we work pretty closely together to hopefully take care of each other and provide each other with resources, right? And so many of the resources are available to myself and my crew in terms of, we have a clinical psychologist on call. We have access to all these other resources. Our wildland fire folks also have the same access to those resources.
Touching back on backcountry experiences, you mentioned the bear canister. Are there any other, primary concerns with wildlife and visitor interactions in the backcountry?
Yeah, I would say number one wildlife visitor interaction, unfortunately, is people getting too close to wildlife, and that's usually on the road corridor, right? So like elk, moose, other ungulates, large animals, small animals, right? It's just like not giving them their space. It's pretty classic. You'll see anywhere along the main road going to Bear Lake, especially during the fall rut, where people are getting within 5-10 feet of these very large animals that could do some pretty detrimental harm. And that's the biggest wildlife interactions we really see. We do have sporadic issues with bears in the front country and backcountry getting food rewards. So like people who haven't stored their food appropriately and the bears being able to get into it. Unfortunately, what that does is, habituates the bears to humans. They start seeking out food and it creates problems. We have folks that feed chipmunks and squirrels and birds, and those birds and other animals start becoming dependent on humans and start begging. And then people get too close and try to feed them and they bite them. And it's this whole whirlwind of problems. But in general, the wildlife problems in the backcountry, I would say, are much less than they are like on the road corridors in the front country.
I do have to ask this question when it comes to wildlife. The Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep is an incredible species, but it's also amazingly adept to climbing and getting through this rugged terrain. As a climber yourself, is it impressive for you to watch those animals,
It is, for sure. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Obviously, the population numbers, I don't know the exact specifics. They're not huge, right? So, it's actually pretty rare to see bighorn sheep in the park, except for some very specific locations. But when you do encounter them, and then they're steep mountainous terrain, and they're just moving through it effortlessly, it's very humbling, right? At the end of the day, and they're kind of doing it carelessly. You're like, holy smokes, that animal is just moving through terrain that, we're taking forever to get through.
Is there any other wildlife in the park that you see up in that high terrain that, is calming to you when you're up there exploring?
Sure. So above tree line, we see marmots a fair amount and pikas. On longs, for whatever reason, there's a fairly healthy population of ravens. We'll see birds of prey. But yeah, kind of for good or bad, there's a lot of marmots above tree line, especially on Long's Peak. Part of the problem with that is they become a little bit dependent on eating people's stuff.
Oh,
So it's a little weird. Like Long's Peak, you sit out in the summer, you on the summit, you stick your hat down. And if you're not pretty cautious, a marmot will sneak up and start chewing on that hat because they want the salt. And so I've seen folks that set their hat down and all of a sudden they go put it back on and the whole top's been eaten out. And it's been within like a 5 to 8 minute period. And they never even knew there was a marmot there.
what does the training regimen look like for you and your team? Is there an off season where you guys are training and preparing together?
Yeah, ironically, this is kind of the end of our training season. We have a few more things going on. Yesterday, we had a flight training with Flight for Life, which is one of the medevac, basically companies in the state we work with. But basically, my seasonal staff comes on late April, early May, and the entire month is booked towards training, basically. So that's like high angle technical rope rescue, EMS, which is medical care, helicopter operations, winter avalanche rescue, all these types of things where it's like the amount of training up front is huge, right? Luckily, I have a fully returning staff that are very versed in these skills, and so it makes it easy. We're not having to teach these things to folks. It's refresher and building on already advanced skills, if that makes sense.
Is EMT, is that part of your skill set then too?
It is. At a minimum, anyone that works in my work group has to have an EMT, and then we have several medics that also that can provide ALS support in the backcountry.
Is that part of your repertoire?
It is. So I'm an ALS provider. There's a couple other on my crew, and there's a few others across the park. But at minimum, anyone basically operating at the level of like a primary job for search and rescue has to be an EMT.
What is PSAR, and what is its importance for people to get familiar with it before they come here?
So PSAR, we love acronyms, and we're a government agency, right? So PSAR stands for Preventative Search and Rescue, right? And that's the concept is really grown over time, and I would say the Grand Canyon was the first real big park to champion it and develop a lot of opportunity and programs towards that, and do some academic research and studies. The concept is that hopefully we can reach out to folks prior to them having an incident to set them up for success, so that overall the number of rescues, number of accidents decline over time, if that makes sense. And so that can be done through a multitude of ways. Part of it's upfront education and training with folks. So we go out to the public. We have, we'll go to REI down in Denver or other types of, outdoor venues and have talks about different various topics. Long's Peak is very, very popular one for us, like how to successfully climb longs, or winter preparedness with avalanche terrain and traveling in avalanche terrain. And so, the appropriate things you should carry, which is 10 essentials, right? But then like how to appropriately use them and know where you're going or how to set yourself up for success. And so that's the big concept, right? Is how do we upfront provide our visiting public with the education and information they need to make good choices, and hopefully at the end of the day, see a decline in the number of incidents and accidents that we have in the park.
For somebody that might feel they're really familiar with PSAR and just recreating, around the park, this is a extremely popular park. There are a lot of people doing a lot of different hikes, a lot of different trails. If somebody notices someone maybe not doing what they should, or there's a concern out in the park, do you encourage folks who are familiar with the rules and the proper way to do things to approach that person? Yeah.
So what we hopefully are doing is creating stewards for the park, right, through the public, so that like the messaging that we can provide and experiences we can provide for folks, that they take that to heart, right? And then they can continue to spread and share that information so that we have, multiply basically the ability of the park service to reach out to the public.
And as somebody who might be receiving on the other end of that information that they're doing something wrong,
sometimes it can be a little aggressive from our visitors. And for good or bad, we have a very large volunteer cadre in this park too. People that really care about this park and have volunteered their time to help us. And some of those folks are doing specific PSAR. Some of them are sitting at the trailheads. And some of those folks can be a little bit, I would say, over the top with the messaging. And that's great. They care deeply. But for some folks, they don't appreciate it. Just leave it at that. That makes sense.
For a visitor that's coming, how important, or maybe not important, since there's just black bears in this park, is carrying around bear spray with you?
Sure. I'm not going to advise people not to. I will tell you personally, and this is me personally, I don't carry bear spray. My staff doesn't carry bear spray. I think the number of instances of folks having like negative bear interactions where they would need bear spray is very low. In fact, I can't remember any off the top of my head. But if that is something that someone feels makes them feel comfortable and safe, and they've prepared themselves in an appropriate way and understand how to use that tool, great, they should carry it. If they don't understand how to use that tool or what it actually does, then there's really no benefit of carrying it with you. We see bear bells a lot also. I'm not 100% sure on the effectiveness of them, but it's if that makes you feel comfortable while you're recreating and traveling within the backcountry and wilderness of the park, great.
One thing that I also want to talk about with safety, and this is always kind of a touchy topic for me, just because always want people to feel like they have access to the outdoors, regardless of what they have. But how important is proper equipment and attire, especially if you're coming here in the colder months or in the shoulder season when the weather is unpredictable?
Yeah, I mean, it's important all times of year, because even mid-July, August, where it's 75 degrees out up high, we can have rapid change in weather. A thunderstorm comes through and it drops to the 40s. We're getting hail, we're getting snow, we're getting sleet. And if you don't have appropriate clothing and outer layers and gear, like, you could quickly become hypothermic, which, depending on how far you are out, could lead to some pretty negative outcomes, if that makes sense. And so I'm not going to tell you what gear you have to buy or what brands or things like that, right? That's really not my purview, but like, having appropriate clothing for changing conditions is hugely important. So for us, that's obviously outer layers or waterproof rain gear, some sort of insulating layers, preferably non-cotton, right? Because cotton doesn't really do much for you, especially once it gets wet. And so that type of stuff, right? And ideally, we're urging people to have enough supplies with them to spend the night out, right? You don't have to be comfortable, but like have enough warm clothing, maybe an emergency shelter, some outer layers, and some food and water, or ability to treat water, so that you could spend an uncomfortable night out unexpectedly.
Crocs are wonderful to put on after a long hike, but maybe not the right thing to run on the trail with.
It's hugely important, right? And it's not only the footwear you're wearing, but what condition it's in, right? And so, like, if your soles of your shoes are worn off, like, they're not going to do much for you if there's no tread. I personally will wear approach shoes with sticky rubber part of the summer when I'm walking on rock slabs and things like that, because it gives me better traction. And ironically, I wear it on the keyhole, and I'll be walking up the home stretch and walking down the home stretch while people are on all fours or butt scooting. And it has to do with like the footwear I have on versus what they have. But footwear is hugely important. In the winter, obviously, you want a good, warm, waterproof boot. Most likely in this park, you want micro spikes, because the trails get pecked out pretty quickly and then become basically an ice skating rink. So traction is important. And even this time of year, up high in the park, there's sections of trail that still I would say you should have micro spikes on at a minimum. And then, like I said, Long's Peak this time of year, additional like traction crampons and things dedicated towards steep snow climbing are what you should have.
Because of the beautiful and rugged terrain of the geology of this park, are there certain areas of the park that can dictate their own weather? Like right now where we're sitting at, could it be calm and Long's Peak be raging with different weather?
Yeah, for sure. Like the Continental Divide in itself is creating its own weather. Predominantly, the winds are coming from the west. Most cold fronts we have are coming from the west, right? So as they come over the mountain range, the weather is going to be significantly different up high than it is going to be in the town Estes Park or even Grand Lake. It may be a sunny bluebird day in park, and you look up and the mountain itself is just obscured in clouds and lenticulars and evidence that there's strong winds up high.
How is cell service in the park? Is it vital to have an inReach if you're going out into the backcountry?
There's definitely, like, cell service, for good or bad, has gotten better since I started working here, right? There's a lot of places where you get okay or decent cell service, but there's still a lot of places in this park where it's a dark hole. There's no comms, no cell service. So having some sort of device, emergency beacon, something that you can communicate out is definitely recommended. It's not required, of course, but, with changes in technology, some of that's actually been good, right? Now the new phones out there apparently have built-in satellite messengers also, so that's another option. But remember, these devices don't work if they get broken or if the batteries die. So I would say it can be a lifeline, but also, like, there's the ability that this doesn't work.
Two-pronged question: importance of notifying somebody where you're going,
sure.
Day of the hike, and B, When somebody does make the call and they call 911 and they're out in Longs Peak or somewhere out in the backcountry and they're hurt, what does that process now look like? How does that call get to you? And what does the mobilization look like to get to somebody?
Yeah, right. So if, first of all, giving someone your itinerary and plan and when you plan to return is hugely important, especially if you're alone, because if you miss that itinerary or check-in point, right, that person can notify us right away rather than us finding your vehicle at the trailhead a day later, not knowing what your plan was. And then if that person can relay in like pretty close detail what information we need, where you're planning on going and timing, that will help us inform our rescue and search response and could be the difference between someone dying and not. In terms of how a rescue call comes in, if it's a relay from a family member, they're usually calling 911 and that call gets transferred to the park. And then we start communicating directly with that person. The same is generally true if you call 911, you have cell service in the park, it'll go to the closest large 911 dispatch center, which here is usually Estes Park. And then that call immediately gets transferred to our dispatch here in the park. And then park rangers like myself get notified from our dispatch. And our dispatchers are trained in obtaining all the information that we need to be successful. And so they'll go through a series of questions or run a ping on the phone to figure out a GPS location if possible and a bunch of other things to help set us up for success.
Do you guys have like a war room that has the topography and that you're able to map out?
Yeah, we call it an instant command post, or I guess you could call it a war room, but for sure, right? We have, with technology changes of Google Earth and all these other mapping softwares, CalTopo or SARTopo, like some of that has now become more digital, but we still in our instant command post have a park-wide giant map printed out with all the information, like key locations, things like that I can quickly just look at and reference, and then I can start pulling up stuff on the computer.
And once you understand from your dispatchers what the injury is that kind of determine what equipment you bring to be able to get somebody out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So depending on location and injury type and weather and a bunch of other things, it dictates basically our response.
As you mentioned, you have a very high stress job and you get support, through various means at the park. But aside from that, how do you recreate and find peace in this park when you're seeing, challenging things like that? Are you still able to go into the park and recognize its beauty and spend time here?
Yeah, I still recreate in the park personally on days off. In the summer, a little bit less because it's so busy. And also I spend a lot more time at work in the summer for good or bad. So on my days off, I may prefer to go somewhere else. I travel a lot with my family if we're going to go other places. We just came back from the San Juan. We were on a 5-day river trip. And so I tried to honestly get out and see other parts of the state that I'm not as familiar with or other parts of the region. Or sometimes we travel back to Washington to visit my family and go hiking there, or go back to Olympic, which I haven't spent as much time in these days. And so it's kind of refreshing to go back to some of these old places I grew up in and see in a different light. But yeah.
You have a 7-year-old daughter, correct?
I do, yeah.
Is she going to be a climber?
She already is. Yes. I mean, my daughter, for good or bad, has been exposed to so many things I was not exposed to at a young age for her. And it's like one of those things, it's like if that's what she wants to do, great. Right? We'll expose her to it. And if she's interested, we'll continue to support her. And if she's not, and not great, but she does, there's basically a kids climbing club in town that she's part of. She mountain bikes because she wanted to. She's in karate, so she likes river rafting. We'll take her out to other places for her to, see skis, so it's a pretty cool childhood for her. Like my parents are a little bit different in the fact that, much more blue collar, and these weren't things that they normally did. And so I wasn't exposed to it from my family. It was more so like other friends or Boy Scouts or things like that.
Does your wife like to recreate outside then?
She does, yeah. I think she predominantly really enjoys trail running, but she climbs and she skis and she does all these other things. But her big sport is trail running.
Depending on the season and my motivation for my fitness level, sometimes I feel like I'm in decent hiking shape, and that's led me to do some indoor climbing. But I've realized that my strength doesn't necessarily translate to climbing. I think it's a different type of fitness level. What would you say is a good thing to train to be a good climber?
Climbing it's not all about pure strength. Like a lot of folks would equate being good at climbing is being able to do lots of pull-ups, right? And that's not necessarily. It's like body movement and balance and positioning that's most important. And then at some point, depending on the style of climbing, some of that upper body physical fitness matters more. But I would say, any activity that is engaging your core muscle group, that's working on balance and hand-eye coordination and finesse is like what's going to set you up for success in climbing. Gymnasts and other like martial arts and folks like that with those types of backgrounds that have come into climbing teams seem for whatever reason to like excel at it. I think there's a lot of skills that translate.
One thing I really enjoy about climbing is it also feels like kind of like a math equation and a puzzle.
Sure.
When you're up on the wall and you're kind of exerting all your energy, but also your brain is thinking about where my foot goes and where my hand's going to go after that. Is that something that you enjoy about climbing?
I kind of equate it to kind of a little bit of it like a chess game, right? It's like strategy in terms of how you approach the route, how you're going to climb it, and how you're going to be successful. And it's, it's to the point for me where it's like some of these other things that I have running in the back of my mind when I'm climbing, like I'm focused on what I'm doing at hand at that moment. And these other things are not like taking up space in my brain.
Once you kind of master a route and how you climb it, can you try different variations of that same route in terms of where you put your hands and your feet to challenge yourself?
Yeah, that's I think that any routes that way. Sport climbing and bouldering, I'd say, have even more of that. Like bouldering, you can change up the sequences. You can do what's called a sit start, so you can start even lower, sitting on the ground rather than standing. So like you can do variations to routes, right? So it's definitely also a bit of like an artistic form for folks.
This has been a really fascinating conversation. We haven't talked about climbing yet on this podcast, and I'm super fascinated by your story and climbing, but I know you're a busy person. As we're starting to get into the summertime, you're going to become even busier. But is there anything else you wanted to mention about the park, whether it's encouragement to get out here or just advice for folks who do want to climb or go in the backcountry? And, I think it's important for people to remember if you're going to go out and do that, not only are you risking yourself, but you're also risking people like you and your team that are...
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I do the job I do, and the folks that work for me do the job they do because they care, right? And so we want to be there to help folks when it's potentially their worst day. We also care about the park that we work in, the resources and the opportunities that people have and that we secure and continue to have those opportunities for folks, right? We all start somewhere, right? We all make mistakes. It is what it is. And I encourage people to get out, explore the park, recreate, because there's huge benefits to doing it, right? But at the same token, like try to educate yourself the best you can in advance, set yourself up for success, right? And make good choices, right? There's no reason that you can't turn around. Right? You can always come back. The park will be here. It's one of those things I've had to learn in my own life, right? Like sometimes mission drive is so overwhelming that's hard. You get tunnel vision. It's hard to see that like, hey, maybe things aren't lining up with the way I thought they should, or I've blown past my turnaround times. It's just being cognizant, right? And just being willing to maybe turn back and realize that I just may have to try again.
Yeah, that's a good point. How important is letting go of your ego when you're doing stuff like that?
I think it's pretty important. It's like what they call summit fever, right? It's like not only you have to get to the summit of Long's Peak or any other peak, but you also still have to have the ability and reserve to get down. And half the battle for most folks and a lot of accidents actually happen on the descent rather than the ascent.
Mike, this has been so great getting to know you, and want to personally say thanks for all the work that you do in this park. And because of people like yourself, people get to recreate in such an amazing, beautiful place. And as we look behind us, the storm clouds are starting to build pretty good. So.
For sure, yeah. I'm guessing it's probably snowing up there right now. Yeah.
Well, thank you for everything, and thank you for spending some time today to chat through some important topics.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. Mike is absolutely incredible, and I'm so thankful for all the work that he does here at Rocky Mountain National Park. So if you like this type of content, it'd mean a whole lot to me if you liked, commented, and subscribed. And until next time, safe travels.